In the race to harness economic growth, one UK business maverick says the EU should turn eastward for lessons in effective policymaking. John Mills joins me with his thoughts. John, in the book you co-authored, you highlighted that just as UK interest rates rose between the early 1980s to the 90s, our Far East Asian neighbors went the opposite direction, devalued their currencies. As a result, these economies, yes, were able to become increasingly more competitive to foreign investors. But beyond the China example, let's look at Malaysia, which has a higher foreign debt burden as a result. And because of that, we're also seeing the country more vulnerable to U.S. currency tremors. So a country such as Malaysia and beyond, do you think that they're really better off?
Yes, I think right across the piece, the Pacific Rim became very much more competitive than the West, particularly after the 1997 Asian crisis. There were big devaluations in Malaysia and Thailand and South Korea. As a result of all this, the gap between the costs of manufacturing anything in the West and the East just widened. And that's why the East has grown so much more quickly than the West, not only in terms of GDP, but better jobs for everybody. And I think that we're in danger of getting left behind while all this goes on.
You say that we should be looking at made in UK, very much focused on selling and buying locally. How do you even begin that process?
Well, I think it's a question of where the incentives are and what is economical to do and where investment goes. Now, because the pound is very strong and Western currencies are very strong generally against those in the East, there's very little incentive for investment in low-tech and medium-tech industries where productivity increases have been secured at an enormous rate in the East, but not in the West. And I think this is why our economies have grown so much more slowly than theirs have, and why we just can't pay our way in the world.
Given the situation we're currently in, I'm not wholly convinced that you would get any economy to really be behind an idea where they are going to look internally when, as you said, they can buy the same sort of products overseas for less. So what is really going to be in their long-term benefit?
Well, I think the real problem with the West is it's facing years and years of stagnation, which is a very, very damaging prospect, both economically and politically. I don't think that this is a situation which we can afford to ignore. If there is a policy that will change things around and enable the Western world to grow at least at a partially substantial rate as in the East, that's what we ought to do, and I think that is possible.
Do you think that our EU neighbors would also follow suit?
Well, there's a big problem in the eurozone, which is that the eurozone as a whole has quite a substantial balance of payment surplus, but that's because they've got one or two countries, particularly Germany and Holland.
Well, I was going to say there's competing interests that are at play. We're still very much dealing with a reality where just 5-6 years ago, we were in a crisis and there's still economies. The disparity couldn't be even wider than it is today. So how do you get broad consensus to be built, or do you need that to be built?
Well, I do think you need some consensus, but you need a change of a perception about what needs to be done first before you're going to get policy changes implemented. I mean, I think, in fact, changing things the way that needs to be done is very much more difficult in the Eurozone because you've got this very rigid relationship between the different countries there, which is in place because countries can't devalue anymore, they can't change the value of their currencies, and this makes it much more difficult for the adjustments to be made in the Eurozone than elsewhere. In Britain, we're not in the Euro, of course, and this gives us the flexibility to make some changes which other people would find very much more difficult.
You're one of the Labour Party's largest contributors. Is what you're saying today in any way a love letter to the party as a whole, trying to convince it to get behind the idea of a referendum, perhaps?
I mean, I would very much hope that the Labour Party would look at the policies that I've been suggesting should be carried out. But these are policies which don't really have an enormous ideological dimension. I mean, they could really be carried out by any political party in the UK. And I think that really what I'm trying to do is to get onto the agenda changes in policy which I think would benefit the UK from any perspective, really.
Let's talk about something that really sort of piqued my interest. Quoted in your book, you say, we've wasted far too much time and resources on the forlorn hope that our salvation lies in new technological miracles, which will allow us to overtake our competition in one bound. On the contrary, what is needed is extending the use of well-tried existing technology, which is entirely feasible, with the stimulus of a cost base that is internationally competitive. You are clearly an overachiever. Are you encouraging everyone to accept the status quo, and are you missing out on the next Apple?
Well, I think you do need high-tech investment and high-tech industries, as well as low and medium-tech ones. The problem with high-tech is there just isn't enough of it. I mean, if you look at the balance of payments structure that we have in the UK, we just do not have enough to sell to the rest of the world, which is why we have a big balance of payments problem. Now, the way to fill that gap is not to try and secure more and more high-tech investment, in my opinion. It's to go for the much easier route of having more medium and low-tech industries. But you'll never get them to operate successfully if the exchange rate is so high that it's just impossible to make them pay. That's the problem.
But then how do you encourage innovation?
Well, I think the problem is that even with high-tech investment, if you've got a low cost base, you're much more likely to make your investment successful than if you've got the sort of situation we have in the UK. But I'm not against having innovation, and I'm not against high-tech at all. All I'm saying is you need to supplement this with medium and low-tech industries, otherwise you just cannot produce enough to pay your way in the world, and that's the problem.
Okay, finally, John, can you tell me, what do we stand to lose if the message you have shared with me today is not heeded in time?
Well, I think we've got a huge amount to lose, because if we're really facing another 5 or 10 years of very low growth, maybe 1% or something on average, at the time when our population is increasing by getting on for 1%, then you finish up with no increase in living standards. If we go through another 5 or 10 years of no living standard increases, I think the political situation is likely to fracture. People are going to get more and more discontented. People are going to get more distrustful of our political classes that run this country. And that seems to me to be a very daunting prospect.